DogWorks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com. DogWorks Radio Network presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.5 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site. You can find all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com. Make sure you check us out on social media by searching DogWorks Radio. And today I am joined by a returning guest. His name is Thom Swan. He goes by Swanee. He is up in the Fairbanks, Alaska area. He is a dog musher. And today we're going to talk about Sled Dog Genetics. It's a fascinating topic. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say about that. But before we jump into that, welcome to the show, Thom. And can you do us a brief introduction and tell us who you are and what you're all about, please?
Well, I don't know that I can be brief. My name is Swanee. Everyone knows me as Swanee. And I am a recreational musher and have actually a lot of interests. And here the past year or so, I've really been focusing on genetics as it pertains to our sled dogs. And it's been a fascinating trip through the rabbit hole, as it were.
You know, Thom, I have been involved a little bit with the Ancestry.com and sites like that, and I know exactly what you're talking about. I found a distant great uncle or something like that from the late 1800s, and once I clicked on that, I was stuck, and I tell you what, it's a fascinating subject to get involved with history and genetics and ancestry, isn't it?
Well, it is indeed, and there are certainly historical tie-ins. My trip down the rabbit hole sort of got started because we started seeing some genetic disorders in the Headland Husky line that I'm heavily involved with. And for some background, we're trying to preserve this very old line of Alaskan sled dogs, and it's really hard to do when you don't have a large population of dogs to work with. We started seeing some things in the line that we were concerned about, but really couldn't say they were genetic. And then one of my own dogs was affected by a recessive disease. It's called zinc-responsive dermatosis. And that's usually seen in Siberian Huskies and Alaskan Malamutes, very rarely in Alaskan Huskies. So that started me digging into the research, and the more I dug, the deeper I got into the science of it. And then some very kind friend referred me to the Institute of Canine Biology website, and they offer just a ton of really excellent courses on genetics. And so basically for the past several months, I've been studying and spending lots of money taking courses and lots of time taking courses to try to learn more about it. And the more I learn, the more I realize that this is scientific information that can be really useful, not just in preventing diseases, but in breeding better performing dogs.
Exactly, and that's why I wanted to have you on today. I got started in sort of the dog world by way of a purebred Siberian Husky back in 1987. And at the time, I was not involved with mushing, but I was involved with competition obedience. And I'm sure you know, in the purebred world, pedigrees are everything. They're traded like trading cards back and forth at dog shows and competition obedience events and the like. And I remember doing a lot of work with pedigrees. And I would like to talk first, Thom, or Swanee as you're better known, is what is the main distinguishing factor that people are looking at when they're thinking about pedigrees versus genetics?
Gosh, I'm not sure how to answer that. What I will say is that, yeah, pedigree analysis is really important. You can learn about degrees of inbreeding. You can learn about diseases that may or may not be present in the line. A lot of information that you can use to make smarter breeding decisions. But ultimately, what the first thing and then the last thing that you need to look at rather than pedigrees is look at the dogs that are running in front of you. Because they really are the ones telling the story. If you have a high-performing team and everyone in the team is a dog that you're really happy with, then it's probably going to be in your best interest to choose your breeding stock from among that population of dogs. On the other hand, if someone that is willing to work with you has dogs that you think you could perform better with, then those are dogs that you should be looking at breeding too. Look at the dog first, and then start looking at the pedigree. One of the things that's really a concern, and it's as much a concern in Alaskan Huskies as it is in any of the pure breeds, is we want to have enough genetic similarity within the breeding pair to be able to reserve or to bring out the traits that we want to see in the dog. But we don't want to have so much that we increase the risk of perpetuating genetic diseases. That's kind of the balancing act that comes from when you're looking at pedigrees. But truly the most important thing, I think, is look at the dog first, then look at the pedigree, and then take another look at the dog.
Great point. So can we take a little bit of a step back here, Swanee, and talk about dominant and recessive traits first? I think a lot of our listeners are kind of have a general understanding of that, but maybe not as quite as much as they would like. Can you tell us kind of quickly what the main difference is between a dominant trait versus recessive? And if you think about it in people, hair color and eye color and that sort of thing, can you kind of compare and contrast with dogs and people for us?
Well, it's exactly the same in dogs as it is in people. It's the same in a pea plant as it is in people and dogs. Every gene consists of two alleles, and one of those is inherited from the sire or the father, and the other from the mother. A dominant gene or a dominant allele is one in which the trait will be expressed even if there's an opposing type of allele inherited with that dominant allele. And the best classic example is eye color. The gene responsible for brown eye color is dominant over for green or blue. So if you have one allele for brown eyes and one for blue eyes, the phenotype, what you'll actually see is the brown-eyed. That's what you'll see is a person with brown eyes. In order to have blue eyes, you have to inherit both recessive blue-eyed genes, one from the mother, one from the father, in order to actually have blue eyes. So there's a whole lot of recessive blue-eyed people walking around.
Exactly. And you often hear when we're comparing people, they'll say, oh, he looks just like his mother. He has blonde hair just like mom, or he looks just like grandma. He has brown hair or red hair or whatever. When you're working with dogs, if we could switch over to dogs now, and you're trying to breed for specific traits, and then we'll jump into genetics here in a bit, that dog that you're looking at to breed right now, if you know very little about it other than maybe who its sire and dam are, you can't really figure out that you're going to have a brood of gray dogs or a brood of brown dogs or whatever. You have to have a little bit more research, don't you?
You really do need to dig a little bit deeper into the ancestry. Let's take, for example, you have a dog that's very tall, and another dog that's very short. Intuitively, you would think, well, if I breed these two together, I'll get dogs that are halfway in between. But in reality, what you end up with is some puppies that are very tall, some puppies that are very short, and you're really unlikely to get that medium-sized dog that you wanted to get.
Exactly. And, you know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about Jim Lanier, and he's famous for his white dogs. I believe his kennel is called Northern Whites. That takes some doing, doesn't it? Of course, he's been doing it for a long time, and you know, having a longer string of white dogs is much more pronounced in later litters. But it's not something that happened by happenstance all of a sudden, was it?
No, that happens through generations of selection, where you are breeding dogs most likely to have the allele responsible for that white coat to other dogs that are more likely to have that allele. And eventually, through several generations, in that population of dogs, that trait, the gene that's responsible for that trait, becomes fixed in the DNA of that, basically of that population. And a population can be 2 dogs living in your house, or it can be 2 million dogs scattered across an entire nation.
Right. So, Swanee, you talked about you're finding an interest in this with some information about genetic diseases or genetic disorders, and in particular with mixed breed dogs. You had talked about a relatively rare breed, considering, you know, all of the purebred dogs that most people have that are listening to this show. How did you figure out first what the problem was with the dogs in your breed? And then secondly, how did you go about the process of figuring out the genetic component of that?
Yeah, actually, I got kind of lucky with that. It was one of my dogs that was affected with the zinc-responsive dermatosis. And what I was seeing in the dog was hair loss around the eyes and some really red, inflamed-looking skin in there. So I took the dog to my veterinarian, who is he grew up in a sled dog kennel. His name is Mark May, and he's just really an amazingly knowledgeable vet. And when I took the dog in, he looked at her and he says, you know, I think I know what it is, but we have to rule out a bunch of other things first. So, my gosh, we put her on antibiotics for 2 weeks, and then we did skin scrapings and looked at those under the microscope, and then we did a surgical biopsy that had to be sent to a specialist outside, a veterinary dermopathologist, who came back and said, yes, this is consistent with zinc-responsive dermatosis. Now, that's a known recessive disease that can be diagnosed. A lot of recessive diseases, a lot of genetic diseases overall from several different modes of inheritance, aren't yet widely recognized. They're hard to determine. What usually has to happen is dog owners will take their dogs that are ill to the vets, and the vets will look at the dog. They have to rule out all of those environmental causes for the symptoms, and when they finally, there's nothing left to rule out, they start thinking maybe it's genetic. So the dog owner calls up the breeder, and the breeder, if they're knowledgeable and if they're really paying attention, will start calling breeders from dogs that are related to this dog to determine if they're seeing the same thing. So it takes a lot of communication and a lot of willingness to be able to say, yeah, I'm seeing this in my dogs. Let's see if we can sort it out. Then you gather around the table with a whole lot of pedigrees, and you start counting how many dogs in how many generations have shown up with this particular disease or this set of symptoms. And frequently you can determine a pattern of inheritance. And when you can, then you can be pretty confident that you are indeed dealing with a genetic disorder, and you can take steps to prevent that from spreading further in the population. But it does require a great deal of just open, honest communication and people willing to say, yeah, there can be something in my line that is of concern. And there is something in everybody's line. Every living creature on this planet carries mutations in their DNA that can be responsible for a disease if it's matched with an identical allele from during the mating. All of us, all humans, all dogs, all everything, all pea plants.
Swanee, you talk about having an open line of communication with the breeders. How perceptive are most breeders to that? In the sled dog world, puppies come and go pretty quickly, and I'm just thinking about all of the sled dog kennels out there and just don't know how much information is kept with all of those breedings taking place, in particular the non-professional kennels. What is your take on that?
A lot of people are very, very open with their pedigrees. They post them on sites online where you can research them. I have a database of over 2,500 dogs where a lot of those pedigrees were gathered off of those open sites. On the other hand, or the other extreme, there are some breeders that treat their pedigrees like the government treats gold in Fort Knox, Kentucky. Yeah, they don't want to release anything. So it's really a mixed bag there. And you know, I don't know what to say in that regard, because the breeders who are being more secretive probably have their own very valid reasons for doing so. On the other hand, people that are very open with their information are a godsend to me, because I'm collecting that information to be able to study it and put it into practical use. But I'm certainly not going to fault someone for not wanting to share what can be potentially very valuable information.
And we're definitely on a dog mushing show here, and we're talking about sled dogs. When you think about a sled dog, typically that is a very diverse breed of dog. It's not two Siberian Huskies that are getting together and have a litter of puppies. Sled dogs are a Heinz 57 bunch, aren't they?
Actually, not so much.
Interesting.
When Heather Hewson did her study on sled dogs a decade ago, she identified several breeds that are foundation breeds of Alaskan Huskies. But when I researched the pedigrees of today's Alaskan Huskies, the vast majority go back to only a handful of dogs that were racing in the 1960s and 70s. Of course, a lot of sled dog pedigrees are pretty short. Mushers not all mushers are really good record keepers, and I don't think people kept really close track of sled dog pedigrees much before the 50s and 60s. A typical pedigree for a sled dog that I see only goes back about 5 generations. It's when it's compared to older pedigrees that we can start filling in the gaps and really getting a lot more information that we can work with. There is one dog in my database that has 16 generations on one side of the pedigree, but on the other side, the dog only has 2 generations. It makes it a bit of a challenge when you're studying pedigrees, but the main thing is, even though it's an open gene pool, and we're certainly free to breed to any dog that we think is going to improve the performance of our dogs, most mushers are not taking advantage of that. Most of us are breeding very good sled dogs to other very good sled dogs without doing a lot of crossbreeding.
You had talked about most mushers have a pedigree of about 5 generations. And for folks that are listening, that could realistically be only 5 years or so if if breedings happen successively one after another. You can have 5 generations develop relatively quickly, can't you?
Most breeders are not going to breed a female more often than once a year, and even that's considered pretty intensive. But certainly if there's a 2-year gap, that's still, you're only looking at 10 years to produce 5 generations.
Right, exactly. So, Swanee, you talked about the relatively closed gene pool of sled dogs, at least current sled dogs, and a reason behind that is because of our geography where we're located. But what are your thoughts about the introduction of newer dogs to the gene pool in years past? I'm thinking about back in the 60s and 70s, and I'm thinking about Doc Lombard and came up to Alaska to race. What is your take on that happening at that point in history?
Well, that's happening even today. Gosh, it was only a decade ago or so that there was a lot of crossbreeding with pointers from Europe, and lines of pointers that had been bred specifically for sled dog racing. So for a period of time there, those so-called Eurohounds were setting new records, it seemed like, every single year in the Open North American Championship. And then all of a sudden, as those genes were integrated more into the general population, things stabilized. We're no longer seeing the same team winning year after year and setting records year after year. And that will happen again as soon as someone recognizes a crossbreeding that'll be beneficial. It's kind of a cyclical thing. It happens, and you see a lot of hybrid vigor and a lot of improvement in performance, and then things stabilize for a while until someone else comes up with the right magic combination. And then again, you'll see a big string of records broken, and then things will stabilize for a while.
Interesting. Swanee, I reached out to you for this interview because of a new Facebook page that just sprang up a month or so ago, and it's called Sled Dog Genetics, and it has all sorts of information about exactly what we're talking about, and I find it really interesting. This has always been a topic of interest to me, and I love going back, as I mentioned at the top, going back into history and trying to figure out what dogs are which and all of that. And I know you're heavily involved with that project as well as a business that we're going to talk about here at the end of the show. But can you tell us kind of an overview of what you're trying to accomplish just on that Facebook group as a group in general, not just yourself, but everybody else that's contributing information?
Okay, I actually started the group and put it out there and said, hey, let's talk about Sled Dog Genetics. And it's been very popular. It has quite a few followers and people that are involved in the group and discussing things in the group. We even have a professor of microbiology and genetics who's on there posting along with us and helping us answer the questions that we come up with. So it's been a lot of fun. There's a very free exchange of information on there. And, I've been enjoying that a lot.
So for the average recreational musher who's not planning on competing in big races, or maybe even not coming up to Alaska to run Iditarod or Rondi or whatever, they just have a small team of dogs, and let's say that they're relatively isolated. Let's say that they live in the mountains of North Carolina, and there's not a lot of sled dogs around. What is your advice to those folks? How can they get started with this and really start to dive deep into their own dogs and that history if they don't have a lot of information from the breeders that they got their dogs from?
If you don't have information from where your dogs came from, it makes it a lot harder to assess. What I would tell that person is take a look at the dogs that you do have available. select the dogs that you like the most from that group and consider those to be your best breeding stock unless there's a reason not to. And one way to find out if there's a reason not to is to learn how to calculate what's called the coefficient of inbreeding. And what that is a mathematical formula by which you can determine the probability of any given allele being identical because it inherited the same allele from both the dam and the sire. There's a lot of information online on how to learn to do that. The Institute of Canine Biology offers an extensive course on calculating or using that information to help with breeding, and that course is free of charge. It's called Coefficient of Inbreeding Boot Camp. You just go to their site, click on it. It'll take you to the link to sign up for the course. It costs you nothing, and you learn a lot.
What is your take, Swanee, on the relatively new products that are coming online for people and dogs, where you can send it in, the swab, the saliva swab or whatever, and get that genetic information back or that DNA profile back? Are those becoming more reliable, do you think?
I think they always have been reliable. What they are becoming now is a lot less expensive. So for a couple of $100, and I can send in the slobber stick, and 5-6 weeks later, I get a really nice full description of what can physically be measured within the dog's actual genetic structure. At any time you can measure something, it's going to be more reliable information than something you calculate. The company that I use tests for all 170 canine genetic diseases for which tests are available, and they provide all the raw data to me just to download it off of their site. They measure the amount of inbreeding within a given dog. So I have actual real number that I can look at, that I can use to base breeding decisions on, or use to assess how much at risk is this dog for a genetic disorder. So I love them. I love them. I will not do a breeding today without having both the sire and the dam tested beforehand.
I haven't had a chance to do that yet, and it's definitely on my to-do list for sure, is to do some of the foundation dogs in our kennel. But if we could go back to that smaller kennel again, we had mentioned a relatively isolated kennel somewhere outside of Alaska. If they just have a small group of dogs and they spin a couple of these tests, is that going to give them enough information right off the bat? We talked about dominant and recessive traits. Is that going to give them enough information right off the bat to breed dog A to dog B, and hopefully nothing is going to happen relatively negatively in terms of genetic disorders or diseases?
They're going to have more information than most dog breeders use. They're going to have a better foundation than is typical among dog breeders. If I were in an geographically isolated region, I'd be thinking real hard about using some of the technological advances in reproduction to help diversify the gene pool. And I have actually done that myself. I whelped a litter of dogs that were conceived through artificial insemination using semen from a dog that had been dead, that had been in storage. Wow. And it was shipped to my vet, who is a very good reproduction vet. He literally implanted the semen in the female's uterus, and just have a wonderful litter of dogs to show for it. So there are technological things that we can do to make it easier to diversify the gene pool, other than flying dogs across the country from one place to another for a natural breeding. So I think I'd be looking really hard at taking advantage of those new technologies and putting them to better use to diversify the offerings within the gene pool.
I agree with you, Swanee, and that used to be a very popular thing to do. When I mentioned that when I got started in dogs, it was relatively common to load up the dog on the plane and ship it off to, a kennel that you want to breed with, and then hopefully it comes back as a successful mating. But I think a little easier way to do it, at least in terms of sled dogs, and especially if you have a lot of information and communication going back and forth, is just go to races and say, hey, Bob Smith, I like your dog. I have a very good female here. Would you guys like to be up for a breeding or whatever? That happens a lot, doesn't it, Tom?
Oh, yeah. Parking lot breedings at races are actually pretty common.
It is for sure.
Pretty common. So I've seen it at multiple race venues. So that's certainly a good way to do it. And especially when you're racing against another team, you know how their dogs are performing compared to your own dogs. So it gives you, I think, a good direct way to measure what this potential mating can contribute to your team.
So, Tom, we have just a few minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about your business and something that you're just kicking off here in the very near future. You're planning on doing this as a service, aren't you? I know we talked about on the show last time you were getting ready to retire. Is this a second career for you?
Basically, it is. I was forced into retirement because of an injury. In fact, a lot of the study is because I was so badly injured, I couldn't get out of the house, let alone run dogs. So my options were to sit around and drink whiskey all day or sit in front of the computer and take these courses and learn what I need to know to be able to use this information to help people as they're planning breedings and trying to breed better, faster, healthier, whatever they need to do for their kennel. So, Star Dancer Sled Dog Genetics is coming along. It's something that I'm going to try to pursue. I don't have to make a ton of money at it, but I need enough to recover some of what I've invested in tuition and computer software, and hopefully help feed and pay vet bills for my own team.
Nothing wrong with that, for sure. So in a nutshell, if somebody's interested in your services, what can they expect and what do they get from you other than one of these tests like we talked about that you can pick up online on Amazon or something like that?
If someone is contemplating a breeding, if they will send me the pedigrees for both the sire and the dam, with as much information as they know about, usually it's going to be a dam and they're looking at several different sires as potential mates. What I do is I plug them into a database that has over 2,500 pedigrees in it. We try to fill in any gaps that they might have in their written pedigree. And then we run the calculations to look at coefficient of inbreeding, mean kinship, a couple of other calculations that we can run to determine the probability of the breeding producing the traits that they're actually trying to produce. Then from there, I can return to them a report on why I think a particular sire genetically may be preferable to the others, what that any of those dogs can contribute or detract from their own breeding program. In these reports, I try to explain the science behind the recommendations, so it's not just Swanee's opinion. What this is what the evidence that's well established in the field of genetics, what the evidence would indicate would be positives or negatives of a proposed match. So that's probably going to be the mainstay service. There are some other things that I can offer. if you have a dog that you're concerned about, if you send me the pedigree, send me the pedigree and $35, and I'll give you a report on everything that can be learned from that pedigree.
That's relatively cheap for not only peace of mind about whom you're breeding with, but also the potential for positives and negatives. I think that's key, that there are going to be positives and negatives to any breeding that you're thinking about. Swanee, we're just out of time.
The breeding analysis is going to be a little more expensive, Robert. What that's going to cost is $50 for the dam and the first sire, and then $25 for each additional pedigree to be considered in the study. And that's going to be a pretty in-depth study of the genetics aspect of the breeding. I can't help with the phenotype because I can't see the dogs, and I don't really know what the metrics are that the musher sees that I can't see. Yeah, the musher has to decide which is the best candidate physically, phenotypically. What I can do is help them decide genetically what's going to be in their best interest, but then they're going to have to take that second look at the dog itself. You know, remember when we started, I said the most important thing is look at the dog in front of you, then look at the pedigree, and then take another look at the dog in front of you. You know, what I can do is help you take a look at the pedigree and see what we can learn from it. But ultimately, the musher has to look at those dogs and make the decision as to which dogs are going to help them meet their goals. I'm not going to tell them which dog to breed to. I'm going to give them the risks and benefits from a genetic standpoint.
Great point. So I guess my last question to you, Swanee, is if a person's looking to retain you for your services, how much time do they need? Of course, everybody knows that most dogs come into heat twice a year, so you have the potential for a breeding at least twice during that calendar year. How much time do they need if they're wanting to hire you to do what you do?
If it's really a rush decision is needed, as soon as I have the pedigrees in hand, I can probably have at least a preliminary report back to them within 2 days. Now, if it's the middle of mushing season and I'm out running tours with the team, it might take an additional day for me to figure out how to make the time to do it. The time commitment on my part for that kind of study is about 4 hours. But, you know,
not bad at all.
4 hours in the day. Excuse me?
I said not bad at all to do a turnaround like that. I thought it would be much longer for that type of in-depth research or at least analysis of what you're trying to figure out.
Well, now, the really in-depth service that I want to offer for kennels is to do a complete population study of all of the intact dogs that are in their kennel. And when I do that, I can provide science-based, it's called estimating breeding values for every dog in the kennel. Now, that's a much more intensive study. That kind of study takes actually maybe 4 days even of just jamming the numbers and doing the calculations and putting together the charts to visualize what's going on genetically. And I honestly don't know yet how much that's going to cost. It'll be reasonable, but it's, you know, I've got to pay for the time that's involved in it too. But that's for the future. For now, I'm ready to do the breeding assessment study anytime.
Great stuff, great information for sure. Swanee, how can folks follow you and find out more about you and your services? I know you're really active on Facebook. You're a moderator with several groups and pages and whatnot, but where's the best place for people to go to get in touch with you?
Email is usually the easiest way to get a hold of me. My email address is Swanny, SWANNY, @ ACSalaska.com. Email works really well. If you're a Facebook user, have a Facebook account, you can look up my profile at Thom Swan. It's spelled Thom Swan. And the little picture icon is pretty obvious. There's a guy with a sled dog who's looking pretty proud of his sled dog. That'd be me. And, click on that, send me a friend request or a message, and we can communicate through there. Right now, because of some other projects that I'm involved with, I'm a little hesitant to put my phone number out on the air. I'm afraid that I have some animal rights activists that are somewhat unhappy with me, and I'd prefer not to be trolled by them on the telephone. It's bad enough online.
Oh, I agree with you for sure. We'll definitely put some links to your Facebook page and whatnot on your show notes. Thom, it's always a pleasure. I think you've been on the show 3 or 4 times, and each time we've had the chance to dive deep into different topics, and it's always fun to sit down for a while and talk to you. You're a heck of a knowledgeable guy, and I always enjoy having you on.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and yeah, it's always a lot of fun. I can stand around here and talk about dogs for hours and hours and hours.
Excellent. Thom Swan is our guest today here on Mushing Radio. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.
From DogWorks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for DogWorks Radio. Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.